I'll now call Professor Barbara Savage from the University of Pennsylvania. That's going to be her paper entitled Mers Tate, Diplomatic Historian, Cosmopolitan Woman.
I just want to start by saying thanks to you for organizing this and getting us all here. And certainly thanks to Howard for hosting us. This, I should say that I owe a great debt to Howard and to the Moreland Spingarn manuscript and archive collections in particular, because all of my published work has depended on that. And so I always credit them for tenure, for promotion, for my entire career, and that's not a joke, so I'm very grateful. And then a little piece of that also goes to the Schomburg, and I was wallowing around down there this morning, and I expect to be back down there tomorrow as well. I am doing this current project on Mers Tate, and so in many ways this feels like circling home to be able to talk about her a little bit here, and to talk about Howard's place as an intellectual hub, because in the midst of this project on Tate, which is a large book-length biography of her, I am going to make certain arguments about the importance of Washington, D.C. as an intellectual center that should, and I think does, rival New York and Chicago in ways that often get overlooked. This work on Tate, it came to me as part of a larger project, collaborative project I'm doing with a group of scholars on Black women's intellectual history. So I came to Tate as an example, a rare example of an African-American woman of her generation with a doctorate who also got a job. Because so many of them who were trained in the 20s and 30s never were able to work as scholars. And so I'm doing a biography of her and her life, her travels all over the world. And so for today, I want to focus particularly on her work, just on her work as a scholar. All of those things, her travels and her life and background are intertwined, of course. But I did just want to kind of focus a little bit on her training, her traveling, and her publishing record, and to raise questions I think about who actually has the privilege of becoming the kind of scholar that we're talking about here today, especially producing work in the 1930s and 40s. And I will start by saying that Tate's driving intellectual concerns we talked about her straddling history and international relations, which is true, but she also straddled both time and space in terms of the regions of her interest as well. So that her first two books were on disarmament and the arms race, meaning the arms race of the 1880s and 1890s coming forward through the two world wars. She then turned to an abiding interest in Asia and in the Pacific, and to imperialist ambitions there, not only of the British and the American empires, I would say, but also the imperialist ambitions of Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific. And then finally, in the 1970s and 80s, which is beyond the period that we're looking at here, she comes to Africa and talks about the mechanisms of empire there. And she's seen one of the primary mechanisms of empire in Africa is the coming of the railroads and the development of the Tanzam railways and other railroad and port empires that are put forward not by imperialist states, but by corporate interests, particularly in mineral extractions and the aluminum industries. And I say all that as a sketch to say that you see someone with a wide-ranging intellect, someone who is brilliant, and there's no denying that, and who doesn't fit any of the categories, even the one that we're trying to place her in here today. And so you're getting me at a time when I'm in the midst of knowing way too much about her to say 10 minutes worth of anything. But I'm going to do a quick kind of biographical sketch and then just talk a little bit more about her work and her arguments, and I'll be happy to elaborate on anything else when we have time for discussion. So this is a woman who was born in 1905 1935 in rural Michigan, makes her way to a teacher's college in the western part of Michigan, an all-white school. She's the first black student, graduates first in her class, then finds that she can't get a job as a high school teacher in Michigan because they don't have black high school teachers in Michigan. So she's forced to move to Indiana and takes the job in Indianapolis at a black high school there. Starts to go to teacher's college in the summer to take courses, as many black teachers did in the 1930s. And in 1931 travels to Paris for the Colonial Exposition of 1931, as did many other African Americans. She attends the Geneva School of International Relations in 1931, and it's there that she realizes that this is what she really wants to do. This is the kind of scholarly work that she wants to do, mindful that at this point she is a high school history teacher. She then returns the next year to Oxford, and it's a long and complicated story of how she gets there, but I will say that she's funded there by the AKAs, who in the 1930s set up scholarship funds for black women to study abroad, and that's how she gets to Oxford. And Grad comes out of there in 1935 with a B.Lit in International Law, International Relations. Then goes to Bennett College, teaches there for a number of years before she goes to Harvard, and where she gets the PhD in government, as you've heard other folks talking about today. So by the time she comes to Howard in 1944 and ends up in the history side of social sciences, she has, and she's not a young woman at that point, she's someone in her late 30s, so a mature person, and someone who comes here and teaches widely, and who also devotes herself to her scholarly interest. And so her first chunk of publications really do have to do with disarmament, as I say, and the kind of the arms race of the earlier periods. She developed very creative ways of thinking about the role of social movement advocacy in those movements, and really talks about disarmament, I guess, and armaments as the first stage of German and British imperialist ambitions, especially having to do with their naval expansions in the late 19th and early 20th century. She is a pessimist when it comes to disarmament. Basically, she thinks it's too little too late, and that the debates about armament are misplaced, because the debates really ought to be about power, not about the mechanisms of power, which is how she saw armaments. And that if you're not interested in talking about the power and the political power, then you're missing the point in trying to disarm. And so the books that she writes on disarmament becomes the definitive histories of that subject, published in the late 1940s by Harvard University Press. She publishes two of them, one on the early disarmament period, and then the other on the United States and its move towards disarmament, or its lack of movement towards disarmament. She sees the rise and the race to arm as being all about colonial ambitions, nationalism, and imperialism. And publishes these first books as I said, in the middle of World War II. She's also publishing in the Journal of Negro Education about World War I and World War II, in an article about the darker peoples of the world, where she's warning against a return to the imperialist mentality, or what she called the master-subject relation after World War II. And this is very, I think, meaningful to her, because she trains 300 black men here who are sent off to war. She is the primary teacher in the Army Specialist Training Program here, and stays involved with these men for the rest of their lives and certainly the rest of her life. And so during World War II, she is interested in military, what we would now call the military-industrial complex, warning against it, and warning against a new arms race, especially in the atomic age that people witnessed in World War II. When the war lifts, she's then able to travel again, and it's there that she goes to India, as you see in some of the slides here, on a Fulbright to India, 1950-1951. And I think it's important to think about India, 1950-51, how close it is to the partition, and the sort of remnants of British imperialism there. I think it's there that she gets the interest in railroads, because I think she sees the British railroad system in India as having been really essential to what the British were able to do in India. And this then feeds her abiding interest in Asia, not just South Asia, as we would think of India and Pakistan today, but the Pacific Ocean more largely, because she travels widely within India, but also throughout the region during that year and a half that she's there, and on her way back from India, comes back through Hawaii, approaching it, as she says, from the east rather than the west. And it's there that she spends the next decade or so going back and forth 12 times to do research on the American annexation, or the coming of the annexation of Hawaii in the 1890s. And again, seeing that process as evidence of imperialist aims of first Great Britain and then the United States, but also making very novel arguments about the role of missionaries, U.S. missionaries in the 1820s, who paved the way for the American annexation of Hawaii later in the 19th century. And so also see that, I think, seeing missionaries and religion as another tool like armaments in imperialist aims. And I think this is a very interesting novel and early way of thinking about religion and missionaries, which is actually why I was originally drawn to her, because I wrote some stuff on religion myself. But she does see this move into Hawaii as the beginning of the kind of imperialist ambitions of the United States that we associate with the so-called Spanish-American Wars and everything else that happens in the 20th century. And then finally, as I said, she ends up in the late 1960s and 1970s traveling back and forth finally to Africa, where she'd always wanted to go, and looking at the mineral extraction industries there, whether aluminum or otherwise, but really talking about the movement of corporate capital as kind of the new imperialist force, if you will, into Africa, and particularly into Eastern and Southern Africa, where she spends all of her time really dealing with the industrial captains of the development of the ports along the eastern and southeastern side of Africa, and the ports then connecting to the railways that then allow the movement not only of minerals but of labor within Africa to send men to the mines to do the work that leads to that extraction. And so, I said it about her work, which I think makes her work sound very kind of routinized in a way, but I also wanted to just talk about the work as a way of giving you a sense of the breadth of her intellect and her interest, but also the ways in which her work in so many ways presaged so much of what we think of as really cutting-edge work that we don't see until the 1980s and later, and also to just remind us that much of the work that she was doing remains unpublished and certainly underpublished, even though she did publish 5 books herself, 2 by Harvard, 2 by Yale, and of which she was very proud. And so I wanted to say that if we think about her as fitting into this so-called Howard School, I think there are ways in which her work certainly overlaps there. I think about her and her kind of driven sense of independence and difference, and how she would think about herself being put into any school, because she was fiercely independent. This 1947 meeting which you talk about, and the publication that comes out of that, which she took part in, she'd been here about 3 years or so, she resented like hell having to do it, because she saw it as taken away from her own interest in her own work. She did it, she did a great job. But when you wallow around in someone's papers, whether here or at Oxford, I was able to go over there earlier this summer, and see what she's saying to herself about having to be the one who's working on the logistics of that conference, there's a great deal of resentment from her for that. And I guess finally, as you would expect, and other people have written about this, and I certainly will, she's also someone who fought very hard here at Howard against gender inequities, being one of the first and certainly one of the few black women faculty here for a very long time, and also with great resentment against the white male professions, whether in international relations, but in particular in history, where she was kind of placed. And it wasn't until 1991 that the American Historical Association, whose meetings she attended often, recognized her, and they gave her a distinguished, like the Lifetime Achievement Award, like they do with the Grammys. And she was in her late, at the very end of her life, but she only got that award because by then, one of her students was the chair of the Committee on Minority Historians, and another group of women, primarily white women, organized a Committee on Women Historians, and they got together and decided that they must honor Murs Tate. So I just want to put that, that in thinking about the work, we also need to think about the humanity of the people who are engaged in the work and how difficult it is to get the work done under the best of circumstances. And all of the folks that we're talking about were working in periods and under conditions that were certainly much more arduous than those under which we work. And so I'm just grateful to be a part of the group of folks who are trying to reclaim this history and to pass it on so that we can have a real critique of the work and engage it critically, because I think they would want us to do that, but also to really appreciate the commitment and the passion and the drive and the kind of obsessiveness it takes to continue to work and to do this writing and research without accolades and often even without being able to get your stuff published. So I just want to end on that down note.
I want to ask now our